For as long as I've known, I have always had unexplained experiences, along with my mother, grandmother, and siblings. I'm starting to think this is a genetic trend, although I feel I have these occurrences more often than they do. I'm now at the age of 29. Most of these experiences happened when I was younger. I'm going to tell you one of an experience I had in this story when I think I may have visited hell. I remember this night very vividly. My parents were harshly arguing with one another, as usual. It died down after a while, but I still went to bed a little overwhelmed. I remember falling asleep like usual, like any other night, nothing different. From what I can explain, is to me, it felt as though my soul has lifted out of my body and drifted into another dimension. It felt like I was flying through the air bodiless and then promptly landed in what I thought to be a dimension of hell. I landed on high altitude light brown rock formation, and it seemed to be a very hot summer day. Everything seemed very physical and realistic. The sky looked normal, but as I looked around, there were no living creatures. Nothing was alive. There was no grass, no trees, nothing but this brown rock material for as far as I could see. I realized I had been placed in near the front of a line alongside with my mom against other people I had never even seen before, facing a little white chapel-like house that seemed to be the only thing in the entire dimension. The people in line looked like everyday ordinary people, except no one was making noise or moving a muscle. Everyone was very silent and still looking at the chapel-like house. I was very confused on what was happening. I began observing, but I never got out of line. I'm not sure why. It felt out of my control to do so. All of a sudden, I heard a very deep, scary demonic voice that muttered the words, "Go inside." I looked up to see where it came from, and there was a huge, transparent, dominant-looking face in the sky. I couldn't really make it out, or its features, or exactly what it was looking at. There was a few people in front of me who began walking slowly into the chapel-like house. They seemed terrified, but had no choice but to go in. A few people had to go in at a time, and the door slammed behind them. We were next in line. I turned to my mom, who was behind me, and whispered frantically because I didn't want the face to hear me, "Don't go in, it's not safe." She nodded in agreement with me, but seemed kind of zombie-like, as she didn't actually reply to me. As I looked at the chapel, there was a huge window in front that I could see in. What I saw was very disturbing and mentally unexplainable. It was very dark inside. The only thing I could see was 4 autopsy tables with 4 people on them as though they were dead, but not dead. I could only see from their feet up to their waist. It seemed like they were dead, but were able to move their feet. They looked like they were freshly dead. They didn't look like they had rotted or anything like that. Each of them seemed to have had a little ticket wrapped on each of their big toes, along with a white blanket covering them. I couldn't even see any further than that. It almost seemed like I was being forced to walk into a torture chamber. I was petrified and unable to move, and the door looked as if it was about to open again. All of a sudden, everything disappeared, and everything went to a fog. It seemed as if my soul traveled back to my body, and I could see myself sleeping. That itself was very chilling, and in a flash, I shot into my body and woke up all at once. I absolutely can't mark this off as just a dream, and I would love to hear any comments, feedback, or similar experiences anyone has had. The Baby Cemetery. In this story, I'm going to tell you one of my many real-life experiences. I was about 16 when this event occurred, and I'll never be able to explain how this happened or exactly what it was that I experienced. I remember falling asleep in my blue waterbed the night this occurred. That being said, let me begin. I woke up, but it wasn't my bed that I was in. It was someone else's. As I sat there confused, I also realized I wasn't in my own house either. The bed's sheets and comforter were white with purple flowers. The room was tan. There was a window to my right that was open, and the plain white curtains were blowing softly as the daylight came through. The bed was located in the left corner of the room, touching the wall. I just laid there, confused. I was still very tired, so I closed my eyes for a moment or two. When I opened my eyes, I was surrounded by 5 dead babies that were all facing me. They were very gray and rotted looking. They stared at me with very dark, soulless eyes. They had a cloth diaper and couldn't have been over the age of 1. I felt complete terror in that moment. I could not move a single muscle in my body or make any type of emotion. It felt like the dead infants were there for hours. Suddenly, they disappeared, and the day became night in the blink of an eye. I remember finally getting up out of the bed and walking through the house. I could feel the physicality of everything I did, and I was very observant. I remember feeling like the house was very sad and lonely, like I was there to help somehow. I walked outside of the house and looked at the front of it. I couldn't put it together in the dream, but it looked very familiar. Suddenly, I woke up again, but this time in my own bed and in my own house. The dream was still very vivid in my mind, and that's when I remembered why the house looked familiar. A few weeks earlier, I had dropped off my friend's 13-year-old brother's friend at his home, but I never went inside. The house was the exact house I had seen in my dream on the outside. This was something that I had to tell him about. The next day, he was at my friend's house, so I told him I had a dream that I was in his house. When I first told him this, he was laughing and denying it, until I started explaining his entire house in detail to him. I told him about the room I woke up in, everything that was in it, how many stairs he had on his staircase, and everything I had seen in exact detail. He looked completely shocked. He knew I had never been in his house before. He started crying and explained to me that his mom has been experiencing similar things. Apparently, it was his mom's room that I had woke up in. The backyard to their house had a very small yard, and then nothing but woods. He told me that he and his mom had walked deep into the woods once and found a children's cemetery from the late 1800s, and the graves were all for babies. Thanks for reading. It's that thing again. Jeez. So one day, my mom had made a bottle for my brother, and she checked it and everything. Then went to get my brother. When she came back to the kitchen, the bottle was gone. We checked everywhere, and we didn't find it. So my mom just gave up and made another one. She fed my brother and bathed him. Then we went to sleep. The next day, everyone woke up and got ready for church. When we got to the living room, the bottle that my mom had made was in the middle of the living room. I, being my dumb self, went to grab it. Just as I grabbed it, the bottle turned really hot and it burned my hand. My mom was scared, and my dad was trying to stay stable. When I screamed, I felt a pressure on my chest, and then my brother started babbling, then started crying really hard, and then my dog looked at me, then started barking extremely loud. Then I felt the pressure come off, and at the same time, my brother stopped crying, and my dog stopped barking. When that happened, I just fell to the ground and started crying. My mom was in shock, so my oldest sister ran to me and just held me there for like 10 minutes. Another one is that when my cousin was a baby, she would fall asleep in the living room, and when we would take her to her room, she would cry, looking up at the ceiling. My uncle told his coworker, and his coworker told him to take a picture wherever my cousin was looking. He did, and when he looked at the picture, it was a huge skeleton head, and it didn't stop there. They had so many things happen, but I'll tell those stories later. Thanks for reading. The Wood Street Years. This may be a little long and oddly written, as I had to write it all down quickly. It's not exactly a single story, but more of a collection of experiences from my old house that I wanted to discuss with you all to see what ideas and theories you all had. My family moved into the house in 1987. It was a 1950s council-owned property that they were renting. The village was an old place that housed a lot of miners that would go to and from the local coal pits, and also had mines under the most of the streets. It was an odd but lovely place, but there were always stories of hauntings throughout the village. It was as if the whole place was a hotbed of activity. Ever since the move to this new house, my family experienced odd things. My sister would complain of people sitting on the edge of her bed during the night. My father was followed by a hooded figure, even outside in the streets, and my mother had personal items vanish. Over the years, the activity became more and more intense. In 1995, my father moved out and went to live elsewhere, but we, my mother, sister, and brother, stayed in the house. My sister complained of activity in the house when we were out. Banging and scraping from the kitchen, items being shuffled, plates clattered. She got so scared at times that she would run into my mother's bedroom and sleep in there. The stairs and landing area always held some nasty element to it, and on the whole, the entire family hated it without any reason to. It was just something we all felt and never really voiced to each other until many years later. If we had to turn off the light in the hall, we'd run out and run back in. If we had to turn off the landing light at night, we'd do the same. We'd run out of the bedroom and quickly turn it off, only to hurl ourselves back into bed as fast as we could. And heaven forbid we needed the toilet during the night. My sister eventually moved out and got married, and so did my brother. This left myself and my mother alone in the house. My mother got a job after years of being unemployed, so I'd often be on my own from 5 a.m. to 12 p.m. It was then I began to really notice things. One morning, I had decided that instead of staying awake from 5 a.m., I would get some more rest. I settled back down into bed and closed my eyes. The next thing I knew, I heard a banging sound, followed by hurried footsteps coming up the stairs. The thing was, I knew it was our stairs, as they had a unique and distinct squeak to them. The top step would creak, and the next two steps up would make a lighter squeak, then a thud. It was definitely them. I thought Mom had come back, due to forgetting something like keys or her purse even, but there was silence. We had a break in a couple of years previous, so I was naturally on edge. It was actually my first thought, so I grabbed my phone and called my mother, who was almost at work, so it couldn't have been her. She also had assured me that she had locked the door, as normal. I was on the phone when I heard the exact same footsteps again. I have no idea how I did it, but I got back to sleep about a half an hour later. A couple of years passed where nothing much happened. Just the odd thing, like items vanishing and reappearing, noises from the attic, and odd smells. Then, we started noticing it again. My mother and myself went to the shops one day to pick up a snack from the local deli. When we returned, there was dripping coming from the ceiling just above the back door. We could hear whooshing from the pipes too. We bolted upstairs to find the bathroom taps fully on and the plug in. The bathroom was flooded. To this day, we have no idea what the hell happened there. This happened again about 2 years after, when we returned from an outing with my brother. This time, the plug was not in, thankfully. It was from that point it began to get more and more frequent. I would see things at night that I couldn't explain. I first put it down to lucid dreaming, but I was not the only one seeing them. I would see strange insect-like creatures crawling up the curtains and on the ceiling. I'd stare at them, and they would vanish after about 15 seconds. There was one time that I was not sleepy, and I was looking out the bedroom window at the street. It was about 1 a.m. at the time, and I saw something very strange on the hedge that surrounded the house. The only way to describe it was a spider, but it had ridiculously long legs, and it was gliding effortlessly across the top of the hedge. My fiance also saw this for himself back in 2009, and he sat there staring in amazement. And he's a skeptic too. Other things I would see were a man in my room. He would be halfway through the floor of the room. The stairs were directly under my room. Sometimes I would open my eyes and see a face looking back at me in close proximity, only to fade in a second or two. I admit that was very unwelcome. The last few years of living in the house had more physical things happen. Objects would be thrown across the room, things would stop working, or randomly activate by themselves. My laptop, which, by the way, does not do it anymore now. I live elsewhere, and we, my mother and myself, would have our covers pulled from us when in bed. I remember one night literally having to battle to keep the cover on me. There were also random and vile smells, almost like rotting meat, and an invasion of flies. Thankfully, this only happened once. It only lasted 3 weeks or so. We even checked for dead animals. But of course, we found nothing. Now keep reading because it gets a lot more freakier. My fiance moved in with me in the house not long before we moved out. He was the type that didn't believe in ghosts. He had been taught from an early age that when you die, that is it. My mother began to date again and was out of the house frequently, leaving myself and my fiance alone. We decided to clean the house up a little, as we wanted to make my mother feel happier. She had been suffering from severe depression. I don't think it was approved of, as things kept going wrong. The vacuum would randomly overheat, even though in this new house it never has. Things would fall on us. Items would vanish. I even had the unit of our old computer literally fling out from under the desk and hit me square on my shin, even though there was no way it could have. I also had the vacuum cleaner itself chucked at me. We would also hear loud thumps from inside the wardrobe, as if someone was punching it from the inside. We'd joke and say, enough of that. Probably not the best of ideas, but we didn't intend to be scared by it, whatever it was. Another thing we noted was that when the door to my brother's old room, which had been used for storage over the previous few years, was left open, the toilet light would turn itself on. We would be out during the day, return at night, and it would be on. Or we'd wake up in the morning and it would be on. But it didn't happen when the door was shut. One day, I recall the door being left open, and I saw a stack of my drawings get lifted and flipped through right in front of my eyes. This was in the dead of winter, with no doors or windows open. Needless to say, I was not impressed and slept with the covers over my head that night. One night, my fiance was upstairs shaving while I was amusing myself playing a Facebook game. It was midnight, so naturally I was hungry. I always get hungry for some reason after midnight. So I went to the kitchen and started making myself a snack. I was addicted to omelet and cheese bagels at the time, so I started making one. After it had finished cooking, I took it into the living room and continued messing about on the game I was playing. I had almost finished it when I heard Lee shout from on the landing. We had no bathroom light at the time, as the bulb had gone and we couldn't get the light cover off to replace it, so Lee was having to use a mirror on the landing. I went up to see what he wanted, and he said that he had seen a man in the mirror looking back at him. I was naturally confused, but my gut did flip-flops. I asked what kind of man, and he said it was a short, bald man. He even said that he stared at him and could see him out of the corner of his eye, looking over his shoulder, as if it was a real person present. Remember, my fiance is a skeptic. I admit, I was a touch unnerved. The door to my mother's room, which we had taken as our own by that point, was open a little way, and for some reason, I daren't look in. I also felt a little horrible cold feeling that felt as if it was wrapped around my ankles. I didn't want to stay up there at all. I went downstairs and called my mother up to see if there was anyone in the family who had died that fit the description. She said there was no one. So I tried to shrug it off immediately and finished the last bit of my bagel, only for my fiance to shout again. He came running down the stairs with foam still on his face, saying that he'd seen him again. Only this time, it was as if he was screaming at him, but he couldn't hear any sound. It had really freaked him out, and he was incredibly uncomfortable. I said for him to finish shaving quickly and calm down. Reluctantly, he went back up and tried to shave, but for some reason, the razor was not cutting anymore, no matter how hard he pressed. Also, the cold tap was chugging out scalding hot water, which burned his hand. During this time, I had gotten onto my mother again and told her he had seen this man again in the mirror. While I was on the phone, I could hear odd noises coming from upstairs. My fiance finished shaving and ran downstairs again, only to pause and stare into the kitchen with an absolutely horrified look on his face. I stopped talking to Mom to ask him what was wrong. He said that he had seen the man again outside the kitchen window, walking past with an unearthly grin on his face, and his was very skinny and looked like he had no arm on one side. I told him to get into the living room, and while I was still talking to my mother, I could hear loud footsteps coming from above me, my mother's old room. My bones were also cold, and the atmosphere was horrific. She suggested I get in touch with my brother so I could stay the night at his. But while she was talking, I felt the atmosphere lift suddenly. It was instantly warmer again, and I felt oddly happy. I actually mentioned it to her, as it was so sudden and drastic. But then, it dropped again. The feeling of dread and the cold returned, and it felt as if something was circling us. I got off the phone with her and called my brother. In a state of panic, I explained what was happening and the fact that we couldn't just stay in the house. We ended up at his place, sleeping in his living room. And now my fiance is more open-minded about the paranormal. The house was never right from the start. I would love to know just what was going on there, but I guess I will never truly know. The day we moved out was interesting too. During the move, my mother had experienced a couple of little things while alone, i.e., a piece of paper scooting across the bedroom floor. But it was when the house was totally empty and the power had been turned off. Myself and my brother's missus went to check the rooms to be sure we hadn't left anything. All was well and clear. Then we got to my brother's old room. We opened the door and we were hit in the face by the most intense cold breeze. It was bone-chilling. It made our eyes water. We turned to each other, nodded, and said that it was fine and we should go. We legged it down the stairs, said goodbye to the house, and left to live in this new house we are in now.